Welcome to our webinar on promising system education leadership practices to address learning disruptions for grade 1 to 3 students. This webinar is being recorded. A reminder to please make sure that you are muted and your mic, mute your mic during the presentation. We do encourage you to keep your camera on, but we do understand that you may have to turn it off sometimes. We will be inviting participants to use the chat during the session, and we'll monitor the chat throughout the session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat.
Awesome. Good morning, folks. We will, as always, begin by acknowledging the land on which we have the privilege to live, learn, work, and play. And though this is a virtual presentation, and we're tuning in from locations from across our great province, Danielle and I will acknowledge the traditional territory that we find ourselves on this morning, which is Treaty 8 territory, the ancestral lands of the Cree and the Dene, and the traditional homelands of the Métis people. I'll now pause for a moment to create space for you all to offer your own personal land acknowledgement on the front for the land on which you are tuning in from today. And certainly we are thankful for these borrowed lands and for the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of the past whose footsteps have shaped this land, and those of the present and future who will continue to shape it for centuries to come.
This webinar today is focused on system education leadership as it relates to learning disruption. Our work as system education leaders is succinctly described in the professional practice standards, and all three of the professional standards, the SLQS, the LQS, and the TQS, include that same phrase of result in optimum learning for all students. Our webinar today will certainly be about achieving the optimum learning for all of our students.
So the outcomes for our couple of hours together this morning, as a result of attending this session, participants will learn about promising system education leadership practices that result in grade 1 to 3 student gains in literacy and numeracy achievement. And participants will also recognize how system education leaders use data to inform leading and learning in their local context. And then finally, just to give you a rundown of the agenda for this morning, we're in that first little chunk now, some welcoming and opening remarks. Then we're going to have the classroom complexity study overview. And then we have a number of vignettes about these promising system leadership practices from Edmonton Catholic, Fort McMurray Catholic, Grand Prairie Public, Prairie Rose School Division, Red Deer Public. And then Gloria will do a little wrap up for us there at the end, and we'll have time for some questions. We'll decide midway through if we'd like to take a quick break, or if we'd like to power through and perhaps finish a little bit earlier. But just to set things off in a nice way this morning, we'll get you to please enter into the chat. What's your name, the school division that you're working from, and some things that you think about when you're wondering about learning disruption and where we're currently at in that context. So as we prepare for the first part, we'll get you to do that in the chat box now as a way to introduce yourselves to your colleagues. Okay, and while we're doing that introduction bit, for those of us who are going to write into the chat box, we will get ready for our next, our first, I guess, presentation this morning. We're thrilled to have Danica Martin with us, consultant. Yes. And Danica is going to be presenting some findings from the classroom complexity study overview. So with that, Danica, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Rogan is going to flip the slides for me, so I'll just maybe do a little finger up in the air when I'm ready to have that slide flipped. So the first thing I'd like to say is thank you for having me today, and I'm happy to be here to share some of the findings from the Classroom Complexity Grant research project and study that I was thrilled to be able to complete for CAS over the summer. The purpose of this study was twofold. It was to look at the impact of the Learning Disruption Grant in school authorities across our province, and then also to explore the concept of classroom complexity and how school authorities are addressing that in their systems. So the study itself, which I think is going to be published next week on the CAS website, includes a literature review, It includes the findings and results from a system education leader survey that was conducted at the end of June, beginning of July 2023. And it concludes with some short-term and long-term recommendations from system education leaders and the research to address classroom complexity. So on the next slide, you can see that we had a great response to the System Education Leader Survey. We had 57 responses that represented 56 school authorities from across the province. And our respondents included a variety of people in system education leader positions within their school authorities. So we were fortunate to have some very rich and thorough data to dig through and pull themes from to inform our study and our research project here that we went through. And so for the purposes of this morning, I'm going to focus solely on the section of the System Education Leader Survey results that really tie into the Learning Disruptions Grant. And so there were two sections in the survey that address learning disruptions. The first one asked school authorities what they use the grant dollars for, did they access the dollars, and how did they spend them. And the second section of that survey looked at promising practices that emerged in school authorities as a result of their implementation of the Learning Disruptions Grant dollars and the assessments and looking at their data, etc. So this morning we're going to focus on just briefly the 5 top themes that came out of the promising practices from the System Education Leader Survey as they relate to learning disruptions. And so the first theme that came out as a promising practice in school authorities across Alberta was building professional capacity of staff. So survey respondents talked about working as a system to provide in-class interventions. They really emphasized the use of effective, universal, research-based literacy and numeracy instructional practices. Respondents talked about focusing on engaging learning activities. They talked about universal mental well-being strategies being implemented in classrooms across their system. And the theme also of addressing student needs in an inclusive environment came up. So a lot of respondents talked about how, as a system, they were putting things in place, PD sessions, providing of resources, providing of release time to do some planning around these areas. But all of those activities were designed to build the professional capacity of their staff. Next, they responded with a theme around implementing targeted interventions to address student needs. So that was a promising practice that definitely bubbled to the surface. Respondents talked about their systems working together and their schools and their school teams working together to ensure that there was small group targeted intervention happening and that intervention was really based on student needs. So tied to those pre-assessments, tied to that assessment data that was being gathered as part of the learning disruption process. They emphasize the importance of early identification and intervention. So the targeted grade levels of grade 1 to 3, even kindergarten and earlier was mentioned as an important and effective strategy for addressing learning disruptions. And finally, respondents talked about structures and processes to support intervention at the school level, but also at the system level. So referral structures and processes, teams of specialists and consultants at the division level who could come in and help school teams to address some of those student needs that exist in their schools and in their students as a result of learning disruption. And then on the next slide, we looked at another theme, which was the use of assessment data to inform instruction and intervention. And so respondents really highlighted the importance of pre-assessment data to identify needs and inform their instruction. They spoke a lot about using data to track the effectiveness of their interventions. So not only to inform the creation and design of those interventions, but also to track student progress towards that optimum learning environment. And exploring and enhancing common assessments in literacy and numeracy. A number of school authorities talked about either reviewing or refreshing or looking at, for the first time, some common assessments across their system in literacy and numeracy so that they would have some consistent data and a consistent approach and response to student need. And on the next slide, The next theme was availability of additional resources. And so this, of course, was a promising practice related to the learning disruption grant. School authorities received dollars as part of the grant application process, and they recognized the value of those dollars, which allowed them to provide additional human resources to facilitate small group interventions in their school authorities. So hiring of EAs and teachers to actually work with students was recognized as a huge benefit. But the funds also allowed some of our system education leaders to purchase research-based resources and programs and then implement those systematically so that, again, there was a consistent approach to instruction and intervention with learning disruption needs. And in some cases, there were some central positions enhanced or created to provide additional support to school teams as they looked at responding to the complexity of student needs that bubbled out of the COVID learning disruption era. And finally, on the next slide, the last theme that we saw in the promising practices section of the study was the importance of collaboration. And respondents talked about the value and importance of teachers and EAs and central office staff working together and collaborating on intervention and instruction. They emphasized the importance of time being provided for those teams to collaborate. And of course, providing time requires resources and funds in many cases. So those themes are a little bit intertwined there. And they really also emphasized, collaboration without data and action-oriented planning wasn't as effective. And so the importance of teams really looking closely at their data and making really purposeful action-oriented plans to address student learning and then implementing those plans and reflecting them and tweaking on them was very much emphasized by the respondents. And so the purpose this morning was just to provide a brief overview of the learning disruptions section, in particular the promising practices that emerged from that school authority survey as part of the classroom complexity research project. And I think on the next slide, we just have a couple of reflective questions for you. So in the chat, we'd like you to think about which of those learning disruption grant promising practices that were identified are evident in your school authority, and the summary of the promising practices is listed there. And how will you continue to prioritize these practices in your school authority? Or maybe start prioritizing some of those practices if you haven't yet. Thank you.
Thank you to those of you who are sharing some of your thoughts there about some of the promising practices that you're embedding in your own school authority. And we want to thank Danica for sharing her overview of the research study there. And you will certainly see many of these promising practices interwoven throughout the stories that we will listen to this morning throughout the webinar. So next up this morning, we would like to gladly introduce from Edmonton Catholic Schools, Sarah Federation, who is the EAL and Languages Manager, and she's going to share their promising practices that they're utilizing through Edmonton Catholic Schools.
Good morning, everyone. Danica, I don't think there could actually be a better segue to what I am about to share today, because as you were speaking, I was like, oh, check, we did that, check, we did that. So I think that it will tie nicely to your research. So as Danielle mentioned, I am Sarah Federation. I am the EAL and Languages Manager for Edmonton Catholic Schools. And today I'm going to be speaking about how we used our learning loss grant to target a very specific population of our students, our English language learners. And to do so, I would like to walk you through how we leveraged our data. Oh, are my slides going to advance? Here we go. And I would like to talk about how we use the continuous improvement cycle to address the literacy skills of our grades 1 to 4 English language learners. So first, I'd like to start by providing you just a brief context for Edmonton Catholic. We are a large urban school division with 47,000 students in almost 100 schools. And since the borders opened up post-pandemic, our division profile has evolved. And we have noticed a huge influx of English language learners. As of September 29th this year, we have almost 11,000 students coded as English language learners. And this large number of students makes them an important part of our school population that requires specific and targeted supports. So my plan for the next 15 minutes is that I am going to describe how we leverage this model. This is our favorite continuous improvement model in the school division because we feel that this model allows us to create an improvement plan that is both flexible and iterative, but is also structured. And I think when I think about continuous improvement, one of the things that I think about that's so important is intention plus action creates that intentionality and allows us to bring about change. So what I'd like to do is speak to you about each of the pieces of this model to describe how we supported this English language learner population. So the first thing that we wanted to do within the explore phase of our plan is we wanted to explore the data and really create an urgency for change. So as of September 22, we had 8,000 English language learners in our schools. And that means that there was really 1 out of 4 of our students were English language learners. And what we'd heard reported from the field is that like these anecdotal comments about how our English language learners were struggling, but don't worry, it would kind of work out because language learning takes time. And yet we didn't really have a lot of data to support what was being shared in the field. And that's where we decided we could really leverage our data from our LENS and CC3. So initially in previous years, we've been looking at our LENS and CC3 data, but we were mostly looking at it in the aggregate. And then we started thinking, well, you know, we're hearing this from the field. Let's disaggregate this data and look at the codes, our 301, 303, and 640 students. And what the data revealed was, in fact, that our English language learners were struggling. We had a significant number of English language learners who were at risk in the LENS and CC3. So we had this broad picture of what this data looked like, but then we wanted to dig a little further into the data to decide, was this something that was happening in certain schools? Was this something that was happening across all of our elementary schools? And so we used our division dashboard to look at data in different ways to create a whole picture of our English language learners. And so we did explore that data from multiple lenses. We explored it from the division lens, then we looked at schools, and then we looked at data from the classroom level. And what we ended up noticing was that this was a problem that was broad. This wasn't isolated in different areas of the city, but this was all of our English language learners. In fact, in that grade 2, 3, 4, were struggling with those fundamental literacy skills. And so once we had that data, we also wanted to say, okay, what research supports that these students might be students who are in particular need? And so we started looking, and what we found is that our English language learners in particular have difficulties with decoding and fluency, and that these difficulties with these basic literacy skills also impact them over time. So it's not just when they're in grade 2, 3, and 4, but these basic literacy skills impact them as they go and transition into grades 7 to 12, for example. The other piece that we know about learning an additional language is that oral language is the bedrock of reading and writing. So if you can't say it, you aren't probably going to be able to read it or write it. And so that's a defining factor in our students' reading comprehension. And we felt that that was an important piece that we had to address. The third piece of literature that's not on this slide, but that comes out very often, is that unlike learning a first language, learning an additional language actually needs to be done it happens on purpose. And so what that means is we need to be more systematic, more explicit, and more intentional as we're thinking about this population of students. So all of these pieces together, looking at the data, looking at the research, really did create, it allowed us to explore what this issue was with this targeted population, but it also allowed us to create a sense of urgency to address this population, knowing that the impact of low literacy skills will have consequences later on. So from the explore phase, we dug into the what's the plan? What do we need to do? And so we started out by developing a shared goal for our work. And then we started meeting about the work and developing all of this plan. What could this possibly look like in our school division? How could we address this gap? So our goal was quite simple. It was to support our early language learners in increasing their literacy skills and specifically their letter sound correspondence. So we really focused on the LENS data. From that goal, that's when we started meeting about the work. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was assess the existing resources, or I'd say assess and leverage the existing resources that we had. Our learning loss grant was not significant. It wasn't millions and millions of dollars. And so we really wanted to think about how we could leverage existing roles within the school division to create a larger impact. So one of the roles that we have in Edmonton Catholic, it's a role that was created 2 years ago, is called the English Language Learner Educator. And our English language learner educators are specialized individuals who have training in Canadian language benchmarks, who have taught English as an additional language overseas, and they come with a very specific skill set of helping students progress through the language proficiency levels. And these English language learner educators work in schools alongside teachers to really bridge the content and language gap that our language learners experience. And this, we felt, was the perfect opportunity or the perfect role to leverage because LEs were already working in our schools. And we felt that if we could add intervention, that early literacy intervention piece to their toolkit, we would really be able to support our students in learning language and literacy simultaneously. Additionally, we looked at the resources we already had in our school division, and we looked at what was already working well. So we've had great success with the Alberta Education Reading Intervention Program, so we knew we wanted to use that. However, there was this piece of oral language that needed to be addressed because oral language really is foundational. And so we have been using a resource called Story Champs in our school division as a way to develop oral language skills of all of our young learners. And we've seen such great success with it that we felt that we could take this resource and we could use it to support this, this initiative. So next, we of course created a plan to collect data. We redid the lens on the students that we had identified. That would be our plan. And then we would collect data in June. We also leveraged our consultant teams, both our English as an additional language consultant teams, as well as our reading specialist to create the plan. So once we developed it, it was time to take action. So what did that look like in our school division? Well, with the funds that we had, we were able to hire 16 LEs and deploy them to 16 different sites. These LEs would provide targeted intervention 5 days a week to the small groups that had been identified as struggling with the LENS data. And we wanted to ensure that this was successful, and that meant that we needed to provide LEs with that additional training. And so we provided them with some intensive training around literacy and benchmarks. And then with consultants, we created a plan to start with oral language and then slowly transition into the reading intervention program as small groups were ready to do so. We also provided a lot of ongoing professional development to the LEs in the form of at the elbow consultant support, where consultants would go in, observe lessons, provide feedback, model for them. And we also used Teams, which was a surprisingly great success. Our LEs are so committed to supporting the literacy and language of the students that often they were doing a lot of troubleshooting, sharing strategies within a Microsoft team to support each other and really build off of strategies that had been successful in other schools. Throughout this program, we remained flexible because we knew that certain groups might progress more slowly with oral language. So in consultation with the consultants, LEs were always deciding when was the time to transition to reading intervention and move away from the oral language piece. Lastly, we spent time evaluating the results of our study. So we'd done our actions. Our intervention took place between February and June. And you can see on the screen that we did have great gains in both grades 2, 3, and 4. This is the LENS data, pre and post assessment. And you can see that all of our students made gains in these areas. Lastly, what we did is once we had these results, we took a step back and we evaluated the success of our program. And in terms of reflections and assessments, well, we do believe this project was successful for a few reasons. First and foremost, we did have a clearly identified goal, and it wasn't a large goal. It was a very specific, measurable goal. And we also really were very careful about being explicit, systematic, and intentional in how we structured the professional learning in the school sites that we selected. And it was effective with the money that we were able to, the money that we had. This was effective at 16 sites. But in terms of reassessment and next steps, I think our challenge is to think about this on a larger scale. So it was at 16 sites, it was successful, but we know that our English language learning population is just growing and growing and growing. And this means that we have to think, yes, intervention in certain cases, but we also have to think beyond intervention. And we have to think about how we are shifting classroom practice to acknowledge that every teacher in all of our schools is now a language teacher, no matter their grade or subject area. And so that would be our next, project to attack. And lastly, I would just like to provide a few reflection questions that you're welcome to respond to in the chat. So what does your data tell you about your English language learners? What existing roles and resources could you leverage to target this population of learners? And how can your school authority pull on existing research and data to create urgency for change? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Wonderful presentation. Some really amazing work being done to support English language learners in your school division. Lots for us to learn from your story of practice. So we very much appreciate that. While we're taking a moment to respond to the reflection questions from Edmonton Catholic, we also, if there's anybody who would like to raise their hand and maybe speak orally to these rather than typing in the chat box, we'll pause for a moment to give you a chance to do that as well before we move into the next vignette. So if anybody would like to respond to the questions or have a question for Sarah, perhaps.
Sarah, I just wanted to share your presentation is really timely. In Grand Prairie Public, we started a project last year focusing in on our grade 4, 5, 6 students of EAL and Indigenous population, focusing in with 4 schools where our literacy and our numeracy data caused us to go, whoa, we need to really look at what we can do to support the children. But also, I appreciate your reference of capacity building, because it's not just about the here and the now and supporting the group of children and being responsive to their needs, but how do we build that capacity for our staff, for our school leaders and our teachers? So I appreciate your presentation. You've given me some good things to think about in Grand Prairie Public as we continue down this path. So I will be reaching out.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Corrine. And again, thank you to Sarah. It's interesting because I think a common thread we're weaving today seems to be this notion of capacity building for sustainability. And as you know, we've gotten this funding now for the last couple of years. We think that we're getting it again, but it seems like we're all starting to think about how do we sustain some of this stuff when the funding mightn't be around anymore. And the students who, you know, have been targeted for learning disruption have now, you know, they've grown up, they've gotten older, but we still want to make sure that we're doing good practices in our divisions. So that's certainly emerging as a common theme. So we'll move now into the next vignette, which is for McMurray Catholic Schools. And I suppose Danielle and I should have done this at the beginning of the presentation since we are the facilitators. And thank you to Gloria for asking us to do that. But Danielle and I are thrilled to share a little bit about our journey here in Fort McMurray Catholic. We both are honored to be directors of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And certainly the Learning Disruption Grant is part of our portfolio. So we're going to share a little bit about how this kind of played out a little bit in our neighborhood. We're taking a bit of a different lens, and we're going to zoom out a little bit and look more at the system leadership component of the using the Learning Disruption Grant. But we thought we would set the stage for our little presentation by providing a bit of an overview of who we are as a school division, because it's important to understand why we made some of the decisions we did. So we are a relatively smaller division tucked up here in northeastern Alberta. We've got 6,800 students, 10 elementary schools, 2 7 to 12 middle/high schools, a newly opened outreach school, which was introduced in our system last year, which we're super excited about. We've got about 385 teachers, 390 support staff, 29 school-based leaders, and 6 division leaders. So that's a quick overview of Fort McMurray Catholic, and that will frame a little bit of what we have to say today. Now, there are 2 things we want to highlight that makes us particularly unique as a school system when it comes to system leadership. The first thing is our geography. So we are a smaller school division. We've got, as you saw there, 13 schools in total, but they're all really close to each other. And that might seem a kind of a simplistic notion, but it really makes a difference for us in that all of our schools are no more than a 20-minute drive apart, which means we can call all of our principals and vice principals to a meeting easily. We can meet in person often, and we know that our larger school systems and our smaller ones who are geographically spread out don't quite have that same ability. So we do want to highlight that this is something that makes us unique, and we're grateful to have that advantage of being able to put everybody in a room whenever we need to do so. The other thing that makes us somewhat unique is that we do run a modified school calendar, and we dedicate on average of about 16 to 18 professional learning days a year for our teachers. So our community members call them No School Fridays. We call them Professional Learning Fridays. And you'll notice on the image there on the slide that all of those blue boxes indicate a Professional Learning Friday. So this is something that was introduced in our system over a decade ago now, and we use it to really advance the strategic priorities of our division to build capacity in teachers, and we're going to be showing you today how our PLF model really has helped us with that sustainability aspect to learning disruption. Over to you, Danielle.
So when we got started with the Learning Disruption Grant, that was Matt and I, it was our first year in this position. And so we thought we were coming into this position with a focus on new curriculum and getting ready for that. But this became part of our first project that we worked on, was addressing this Learning Disruption Grant. And at that time, when it was first announced, we had thought that this was going to be a one-time, allocation of money that we could utilize. And so we wanted to make sure that we came at it from the perspective of that same idea of sustainability. And so we came together and we really engaged our school leadership teams to come together and make sure that we had core beliefs that were coming together to help support all of our division schools. And so our core beliefs that came together through that process was that we wanted to work on ensuring that this became a catalyst for sustainable shifts in teacher practice. We didn't just want this to be a one and done project. We wanted to look at how we could leverage this as a way to make long-term changes to our division. We also wanted to look at making sure that classroom teachers were at the center of our learning disruption programming. We had a history in our division of giving a lot of our intervention professional development to our educational assistants and our literacy EAs within our school division, but we wanted to make sure that we were looking at the overall tier 1 practices of our teachers, as well as bringing intervention practices into the classroom. In looking at the need of our students, and their immediate needs, we also felt like it was important to have some pull-out intervention in order to provide that immediate need of support for the students who were in front of us right now. We also wanted to look at having a systematic approach to make sure.
So year 2, our regular business handled some teacher capacity stuff and the building of those instructional practices. And then we focused our grant money solely on an intervention team. We were very lucky to have 4 wonderful skilled teachers who had just retired and said, hey, we'll do a little contract. And we were able to bring them back and they were able to support some really good things in schools. And that brings us to the future. Danielle?
So for year 3, we looked at what we could continue to sustain through those practices without knowing, essentially, we still haven't received the money for year 3, but we're still planning forward in the absence of that right now. One thing that we do have built into our Professional Learning Fridays is our teacher PLCs. And so what we have done is brought in some of those practices from what we have been doing through the Learning Disruption Grant, and our catalyzing factors here is to refocus our teacher PLCs on student learning data. And so we have very strict measures in place for teachers to be looking at student learning data and incorporating it continuously into their teacher PLCs so that we're always working on moving student learning forward as efficiently and effectively as we can. The second thing that we have done is that we have incorporated lead teachers into our classroom timetables. So in every one of our schools, now last year we brought this into our elementary schools as a way to continue that teacher collaboration and teacher support from the ground level. So all of our schools had a literacy and a numeracy lead teacher. And this year, because of the success that we have seen, we have expanded that to our high schools as well. So our middle schools and our high schools all have literacy and numeracy lead teachers who are helping to embed those practices and move them forward within each of our schools. The other thing that we continue to work on is building coherence, and often in the name of new curriculum, we're looking at instructional practices, we're continuously looking at resources that are deployed to the schools and how we can build coherence amongst our schools and learn from one another in terms of what is working in one area that can help support another school. The other thing that we've brought in this year is our collaborative learning cohorts. So where on our Fridays we had time for teachers to meet together in grade level teams and do some work, what we found from last year was that the teachers felt like they didn't have enough support or enough guidance.
Terry Reid from Black Gold here. Thanks, Danielle. I don't know if we used it as a catalyst force or if things were just coalescing for us right at that moment where we were already looking to improve literacy and numeracy, and we had provided some time in each school for instructional support teachers. So that model came into effect sort of at the same time and provided that additional help. But then the Learning Disruption Grant allowed us to go a little farther, a little faster. And so it really, the focus of those lead teachers in each school is about supporting division priorities and one of our strategic priorities.
Okay, so next up, we would like to introduce from Grand Prairie Public School Division, James Robinson, the Deputy Superintendent of Schools, and Corinne Cruz, the Director of Teaching and Learning.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much. I'll move on to our next slide here. Just to help situate us a little bit, and it's really timely to have us partnered here with Fort McMurray Catholic, given our geographic location and a lot of similarities in the province and in our thinking about how we create change in our system. So in terms of background, Grand Prairie is situated in northwestern Alberta. If you look at the little map, there's a star in the middle of the yellow circle, which indicates Grand Prairie's geographic location. We're a city of about 70,000 people. servicing a much larger trading area. If you think about the circle that's shown in that little map, there's about 175,000 people that would report Grand Prairie as the primary center for their regional hub for the work that they do. So lots going on in a relatively small city. A little bit about our division. We currently have about 8,800 students. We had just under 5% growth this year, the same numbers for last year. And cumulatively, we've had about 12% growth in the last 3 years. So lots of change happening in our system, and really reflecting. Green talked during the Edmonton Catholic session on English language learners about that being something that's impacting us as well because of the growth that we've seen in our city. So 18 schools, a smattering of K-6 and K-8 schools and high schools as well. We have some programs of choice as well as schools of choice as well. And about 1,000 staff, roughly split into about 500 teacher FTE and 500 support staff as well to support learning in our school division. By way of background, we call it pre-2020, pre-pandemic, we certainly had an awareness that we had some challenges in our system with student achievement, particularly in grades 1 to 3. And the way we have it written on the slide is things were not improving, and they were either staying the same or stagnating. And that really was something that we were aware of, but we didn't really have a good understanding exactly what our data picture looked like. Our pre-intervention data was weak at best. We relied on feedback from teachers and from administrators about what they were seeing in classrooms and trends that we were seeing, but we didn't, and we had pockets of different intervention and different assessments that were happening in schools, but we didn't have a shared way of understanding what our data looked like. We were using Fountas and Pinnell as a tool, which is a great individual tool, but when you try to use it as large-scale aggregate data, it really doesn't work to provide you much of an insight into what's going on in terms of instruction and student achievement and those sorts of things. We developed an in-house numeracy screening tool. Likewise, that was a very good tool for individual teachers, but was not really scalable in terms of being able to use it for very much information for us. So in a sense,
There we go. So like Matt and Danielle, I was brand new to my position, and like you, I thought I was going to support the implementation of curriculum, but was really grateful to have this opportunity to support our grade 1 to 3 students. And so we looked at a framework. So knowing, so what I'm going to share today and what James and I will talk about, it isn't new to anyone. What we created for intervention, it's not new. But our experiences and our reflection helped us to pinpoint what was really critical. So we knew that we had to be really intentional. We had to have these purposeful components in our framework, and we had to have a structure that would have different processes that enabled what we needed to do with our work. We know that a framework provides an opportunity to take something that's conceptual and to actionize it, to make it real. And we know that a framework provides this common foundational language that was going to be really key in our system. And we were going to be moving at a really rapid rate. And because we had a huge sense of urgency, as did everybody across the province, to support. So when we went to look at developing a framework, these are a series of questions that we asked ourselves to help to pinpoint what this framework was going to need to have, and what kind of components was it going to need. And so I'm going to speak specifically to bullets 1, 3, and 7. And so number 1 talks about the practice with formative data. So that wasn't something that I necessarily had consistency with as a school leader. It always seemed to be the missing piece. So how do I take what's happening in intervention? How do I get really quick, real-time data that I can use to make decisions to be responsive in my plannings as the teacher, as the intervention teacher? And then how did I share that with my school leader? And as the school leader, I thought about that. How did I get formative data to make decisions to support teachers? So that was a really critical piece we had to look at. Then we had to look at collaboration, where we have a culture of real true collaboration in Grand Prairie Public. And so that we had to leverage that, because we had to ensure that there was collaboration with school teams and with the system. So what was my role going to be as the director of teaching and learning? We hired 2 program leads. What was their role going to be? How are they going to collaborate with school leaders and teachers and intervention EAs that we ended up hiring? So collaboration was key, and not just saying we collaborate, but we could see that collaboration because it would have the impact for student growth and achievement. And the last was really, really critical. Again, coming back to that formative data, our experience as leaders and as teachers is the child learns something in intervention. So our intervention model, like most of yours, I'm assuming, it's very intentional and it was very focused. We were not looking at breadth, we were looking at depth for the children. And so we had to ensure that what happens in intervention as new learning gets transferred to the classroom as practice. So how does that child practice, and how do we support that teacher with that practice? And so what was this going to look like? So I'm going to really quickly highlight the framework that we developed, and it was developed really in a very short amount of time, and we were up and running by, I think, August of that year, or sorry, October, I think that year, James, if I'm not mistaken, our first year, like end of September, beginning of October, we were up and running in schools, trying to work the kinks out of things. So we have we continue, and we are into our third year of this framework with a high level of success. So we have 2 program leads, 19 intervention EAs that support our 15 schools. And so our 2 program leads are in our buildings consistently. They have a schedule so people can rely on assessment, instruction, and communication at a daily level, a weekly level, and a cyclical or a monthly level. So here's just a quick glance at here's what our framework looks like from a big high level, I guess, if you want to say. So you can see here's all the team members, and everybody has a role to play. It just depends if your role is a daily role, if it's weekly, or if it's monthly. You can see that clearly there are some people that have a much critical role than somebody like myself. My role as the director, for example, is connecting with our school principals. Year 1, I met with them every 6 weeks for half an hour, and through a series of guided questions, gauged how things were going. And that also then informed what we needed to do as system leaders to support our school leaders. I did not do that last year, but I am circling back to that this year. That's a really key piece, is for me to stay connected with school leaders. This particular slide just speaks to what the expectations are for an educational assistant who is an interventionist. And when this framework was developed, it was shared with school leaders. It was clearly communicated. We ensured that teachers knew what their role was, that an intervention EA knew what their role was. And so each person in our framework has really clear and tight expectations. And that just keeps everybody informed. It keeps it very predictable. It keeps it very tight. And there is no uncertainty as to what somebody's role is going to be to support our children in intervention. One of the ways that James and I wanted to share our learning is we took the 4 focus questions, and we're actually I'm gonna finish up our presentation, and James, feel free to chime in at any time. Just to highlight some of the pieces from our work that we continue to do and what we're learning. So from those promising practices, I want to speak again to the notion of how critical collaboration, formative assessment, the accountability piece, the instruction, and the communication, how critical those pieces are in our work. Like everybody here today, we're building capabilities in our system for long-term sustainability. We, of course, our focus is to support the children, the here and the now, but we need to ensure that what they have an intervention, it helps us to know that we have to have this intentional professional learning. And again, alluded to in the 2 previous projects from Sarah, Matt, and Danielle. We as system leaders know that we have to be focused and intentional in our professional learning for our leaders and for ourselves to continue to understand how do we use the data, how do we present that in a way that makes sense? How do we support teachers to know how to use data that's really responsive to their planning to support all of our students? Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to get to this optimum learning environment for our students. What kind of lessons have we learned along the way? I think James and I would both say, and our superintendent Sandy is in with us today. I think he's still here. We've learned a lot of things along the way, and we continue to learn. We really have validated and learned that we have to have a standardized approach to formative assessment. That's a given. We must have that. We're really so appreciative of our teachers and our school leaders. They've done a great job, and they continue to do that. And we recognize that our focus of being instructional leaders, it brought us back this year to the importance of being visionary leaders. And so as system people, what does that look like for us? And what does that look like for our school leaders when we share where we want to go and what do we want to see? Are we really communicating that? Do people really know that? And the last question is that I'll finish up with is what are our next steps? Well, to continue to learn from our work. As I said, we learn something new every year. This project has, I can't believe what I've learned as a leader, but this project has really given our system some great knowledge. We continue to work with their schools in auditing structures because we want to be able to replicate this framework at the school level. And so how do we help our school leaders to do that? What do they already have? What's
awesome? Excuse me. Thank you, Karine and James. Wonderful presentation. And we'll give a moment for that reflection question of somebody. I think it's a great one to think about, you know, if we were to stop one of our teachers in the street and said, hey, what is our school division's vision? Are they able to articulate it? And I think that would be a
Matt, can I just, although my time is up, I'm gonna chime in a little bit. You know, we really thought about this a lot as system people when we were at CAS this summer, when we were listening to Santiago, the six of us as system people, we had this conversation. Do we as system people articulate our vision? There are pieces of it we do really well and we're consistent with. And there's other pieces that we're not so sure. And so when we came back and we thought about some of the work that we do with our school leaders, that's a big focus for us this year, is that visionary leadership. And what does that look like? And how do we communicate that? And what do people, what would people say about our visionary leadership with different aspects of our jobs?
Great. Thanks, everybody. We're looking forward to chatting a little bit about what our school division did to use the learning loss funding and to take advantage of that opportunity. We're from Prairie Rose School Division, and so our setting is in the southern part of the province, and we encircle Medicine Hat. And so we serve all the way north to Oyen, New Brigden, Acadia Valley, and then we go in the other direction, Ralston, the Suffield area, and then we go out to Bow Island and Foremost. So we sort of do a full circle, serving some of the most rural areas in the southernmost part of our province, but then we also have places that are quite adjacent to the city. So one of the biggest challenges we always face is the geographic diversity. It takes us to go from one end to the other of our division about 4 hours. And so it is quite spread out. And there's lots of snow on the ground today. So there's lots of buses that aren't running for us. And we always have to take that into consideration as we're planning. We also serve 18 Hutterite colonies. And so that's a major portion of our population as well. One of the things that it sounds like maybe some others also dealt with is that we had a lot of executives changes happening right when we were working through COVID. So almost our entire executive is new and within 2 years of service. So part of the transition to move us from the time that education was so disrupted during COVID was also the fact that we were dealing with a nearly entirely new staff. Also, we had a lot of new principals in that time, which might be the case for some of you. In the data that we were receiving, and we used something called MAP testing. As it currently stands, I believe we are the only school division in Alberta that uses MAP. for reading. We use it a little bit for math, for numeracy, but primarily for reading. And that data really suggested to us that we need to increase our focus on phonological awareness, sound letter correspondence, and really attack some fluency needs within our school division. So we did have that data to suggest that was an area of focus for us prior to the opportunity to receive this grant funding. Additionally, though, we also had a different kind of feedback that wasn't necessarily connected directly to literacy and numeracy. And that was just that we were noticing a narrative shift with the general population towards schools. So we were noticing the way parents were speaking about schools, even the way some of our own staff were speaking about those schools required, from our perspective, a little bit of shift in how we were talking. And we wanted to change speaking about gaps and maybe, perceived deficiencies in the learning environment to opportunities and all the things that were going well, because our division did have a lot of successes during that time. And so we coupled this opportunity to really focus on literacy and numeracy at our primary levels with a bit of an internal and external marketing campaign as well, which we'll speak a little bit about. Boyd, is there anything you wanted to jump in here on this slide, or should I go to the next one?
No, I think we're good. I guess the only thing that I'd add too is I think coming out of the pandemic, one of the things we noticed too was a lot of the schools in our really remote kind of southern Alberta schools, it was almost a little adversarial, the school relationship with the communities that we had, and even the degree of the focus of our SI days in school, talking around teaching and good practice and high yield strategies that we really started to focus on, with our school goals being like literacy and deeper learning prior to the pandemic, kind of started to become blurred, and conversations were more about regulation on those days. And so it seemed that, once we kind of started, out of the pandemic, our focus we shifted it back, especially with our admin group, starting there on just being instructional leaders and starting, to get our schools back in a direction that focused on education. And I think that's the only piece I'd add, Reagan, a bit to that, about kind of where we were at, just getting started into where we were going to go with data and whatnot.
Okay, thanks, Boyd. So the next thing that we talked about was promising system leader practices. So one of the things that we really wanted to do, given that we were in a period of considerable stress in southern Alberta, especially in the rural parts, there was a lot of divisiveness amongst our communities, and we knew that we wanted to provide our teachers with really high quality resources that they could use to help them shift practice. We felt like they absolutely deserved that support, and we wanted to be able to implement it with fidelity. And then, of course, we wanted something that we felt aligned with the latest research. And so as we investigated sort of the plethora of options to consider, we really landed on UFly. And I know everyone on this call will have heard about that resource. We connected with the University of Florida, and I actually spoke to the researchers at length, and we actually brought them to our division to help with that launch. Since then, I believe there's a number of others who have utilized their service, but one of the biggest advantages to us was, of course, given our geographic dispersity, it's really hard for us to bring teachers together. I know it's hard for everyone, but having them come in is such a challenge for us. And this resource provided the support that they needed in terms of fidelity of implementation, in terms of consistency, and some system-wide clarity with respect to literacy instruction. And there was some fuzziness for sure on our staff on how best to move forward in this regard. It just created, I would say, almost like a stability and confidence of our teachers, and gave them sort of the space to dive all in. It's not particularly complicated. It's straightforward. It is a resource that does require additional work in terms of high quality literature and comprehension. We've also coupled it with the writing revolution, which has been quite transformational for us. And we have found that decision really helped teachers get on board. The other piece that was fantastic for us was that, you know, we're a really small division, so our capacity is somewhat limited. And the effort and investment this group has made into building out resources that are free, like completely free, has been incredible. So a few things really attracted us. One, it was not tightly tied to a publishing company. And so this was actually tied directly to a university research team. They had unbelievable, oh, sorry, was someone jumping in there? They had what I would say just like a remarkable commitment to creating videos of implementation, and they're really short. So you know how sometimes you'll engage with professional learning and it's like a 45-minute commitment to watch a video, or a really long amount of time in order for you to sort of get this short snippet of something that you need, whether it be a particular sound letter correspondence and how to say that well for your youngest learners, those types of things. The videos are very, very fast, easy to search, and provided our teachers with that on-demand support that they needed right in the moment in their classroom. And we just got such high positive feedback from our staff with that support. And then on top of that, there was extensive resources for parents. And we haven't necessarily implemented all of them, but what we were able to do was in our newsletter, send a little video that showcased what we were working on. We were able to use that in our social media campaigns to help parents see all the incredible work that our teachers were doing in the classroom. And it helped shift this perception that had begun to develop amongst our parent populations, that sort of cast teachers and even sort of the institution of school in a fairly negative light. And it was one of the ways that we began to sort of shift that. And for us, it was just so important that we had this partnership with UFly, because we just didn't have the capacity internally to develop all of those resources on our own. So I think those are the sort of key points for the UFly implementation. The other thing it allowed us to do, because that resource is sort of packaged, if you will, in terms of like daily lesson implementation, it allowed us to shift some of that deeper professional learning work to writing. And we really wanted to emphasize the connection between reading and writing, and that the writing piece was really essential. We were seeing in high school, we were seeing kids in grade 10 who were actually having to put the cognitive load on letter formation rather than the content of the writing. That's how far the regression had been in terms of. Okay, so for data to inform, the LINS and CC3 were both assessments that were really great for us. We also connected our instructional leads to this data. And so our instructional leads met with every school and school team to go through the data and talk it out with them, and connect it to the practices they were using in the classroom once they had that feedback. Most of our staff chose to do the assessment 3 times, so they had that mid-year round of feedback as well, which allowed for sort of in-flight adjustments as we went. And then we do use MAP twice a year as well, and that allowed us some consistency. Where we have the most work to do is connected to numeracy. I was looking forward to hearing all of your approaches for that, because there is some work we still need to do in that area for sure. But we have seen from the interventions that Alberta Ed sent out, and we've continued to use them even now, we have seen some significant growth with those. But that is an area we intend to focus on more going forward. And then the last thing we have on our slide connected to data is around the exhibitions of learning. So every single one of our schools created an exhibition. The exhibitions focused on learning growth. So that was actually what they had to display, sort of like that Austin's butterfly video everyone has seen so many times. So they had to showcase multiple iterations of the work. And many of our primary teachers chose to show auditory, reading, captures over the course of the year. So they might have 3 or 4 audio files of a student reading or a piece of writing growth throughout the year. They didn't all choose to demonstrate growth in that way, but many did. And that helps solidify with our communities too, the work that teachers were doing to improve learning and the performance of our students.
Thank you, Reagan and Boyd. We appreciate hearing your perspectives and the descriptions of the processes that you've brought into your school division and the specificity of that. So if you have a moment just to quickly type your responses into the chat box there, what are the top leadership moves you have observed or initiated that resulted in lasting shifts in practice? And without further ado, we are going to introduce our last team. So our last team comes to us from Red Deer Public Schools. So we would like to introduce Sherry Jensen, the numeracy coordinator, Sherry Jensen, the literacy coordinator, and Dan Lure, the deputy superintendent.
All right, thanks, Danielle. You advanced our slides on us. You did some work here, but good morning, everyone. I want to first start by thanking Gloria for inviting us to share how Red Deer Public went about addressing our learning disruptions back in 21-22. So, however, when I saw that we're slated as the 5th of 5 divisions to present, I wondered if there's anything left for us to share, and it turns out my reservations were warranted. But I do want to thank the colleagues that went before us for giving some really good things to think about. I think if you're anything like me, maybe your teams that are watching this, we are having our text messages that go, that was a great idea. Why didn't we do that? And writing some notes down. So I think that's an indication of what we're learning here today. Hopefully we can share with you, or what we're about to share can provide you with a little food for thought. And at the very least, it'll reinforce some of the things that others have shared today. So as Danielle mentioned, so I'm fairly positive everyone knows where Red Deer's at. If you ever traveled down Calgary to Edmonton on the QE2, you've passed right by our little piece of heaven right here on Earth. And we have 22 schools that are configured around a K-5 elementary, 6 to 8 middle school, and 9 to 12 high school model. We do have 3 K-8 schools as well as a K-12 Christian alternative school. So in our division, we have 209 EAs that work alongside 608 teachers. And we serve around 11,424 students. So whenever I look at the how and why of divisions are doing things, I like to know a little bit about their context. So with this in mind, I want to share with you our context back in 2021 as we looked at planning for learning loss. So first of all, our superintendent, Chad Erickson, has set the expectation through modeling that we will lead by putting our people first, by having empathy and by showing compassion for those that we serve in central services, which includes our students, our staff, and our parents. He really encourages us to be aware of where our people are at and make sure that we're listening to what people's needs are. And so when you look at these expectations, you'll notice that these are some of the key characteristics of servant leadership. And it's through this focus that we designed and planned our intervention strategy. So in our division, we have a well-established practice of benchmarking literacy through Fountas and Pinnell, and numeracy through the math intervention programming instrument, or MIPI. At the end of our 2021 school year, we saw far fewer benchmarks than we would have expected based on our grade 1 to 6 population. And for those that we did see, we were seeing lower results. This was our first indication of how much our primary students had been disengaged. Then in the 21-22 school year, our beginning of the year assessments were showing larger numbers of students not meeting the expectations of grade level. This led us to believe that we need to be part of whatever Alberta Education was providing to school divisions to support students. It also led us to decide to take a look at the Alberta Education's literacy and numeracy assessments and their intervention programs to see how that differs from what we've done in the past. We made the decision to apply for learning loss funds as we're concerned about our at-risk learners. However, we are also thinking about our people. After the famous best summer ever, our primary teachers were returning knowing that new curriculum was coming. They were not knowing what close contact parameters and isolation would look like, and they had no clear picture of what the extras in the classroom would look like. For example, remember sanitization and proximity requirements. In short, our teachers had a lot of anxiety about the upcoming year. So Learning Services was concerned about our teachers' capacity to take on something else, and we decided that our plan needed to minimize the addition of extra expectations on our teachers as much as we could. And finally, as the school year began, we were finding that the primary instructional leaders in our division, our principals and vice principals, were spending way more time dealing with student behaviors and parental expectations than they ever had before. And while there was a desire among our administrators to help teachers get their students back on track in math and reading, essentially, we really believed our leaders were stretched thin. So that left it to the learning services team to plan and implement an intervention strategy. As you've learned, we're a team of 3 for numeracy and literacy. And by team of three, I mean Sherry and Sherry do all the work, which they did all while getting ready to prepare our K-3 teachers for the EAL, AL, and mathematics curriculums. So in this presentation, we've been asked to identify leadership practices that resulted in grade 1 to 3 student gains in literacy and numeracy, and to talk about how we use data to inform learning. In doing an autopsy of how we went about this, we found that we can identify some practices that we used data in 4 key areas. These were identifying students, targeting the allocation of funds, hiring practices, and supporting the intervention. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, or SJ1, to talk about the leadership practices we believe helped in the successful implementation of our interventions.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.
Let's explore how we use the data to lead the learning. Our first step was determining which students were at risk by administering the Alberta Education Assessments and applying for the grants. All the funds we received went directly to schools to hire staff. We used the number of students at risk in math and reading to determine the amount of money each school received. Next, we provided guidance on how to spend the funds. We worked with our human resources team to create a standard cost calculator for principals to maximize the impact of the funds by exploring different hiring scenarios. The funds allocated to schools were based at the students at risk and for contracts for 14 to 16 weeks. This calculator assisted principals with determining the best scenarios for each school, whether it was hiring educational assistants, teachers with 1 to 2 years experience, or increasing the current part-time staff. In some cases, principals actually hired staff, 1 or 2 year teachers, to cover classroom instruction so the experienced expert teachers could facilitate the small group interventions. Ultimately, it was up to the principal to figure out their staffing situation, but with clear guidelines on how it looked. Finally, school learning teams were also encouraged to group the students according to the results in the assessments and to guide them on where to begin the intervention. Some schools mixed grade groups according to scores when it was appropriate. This spring, we were unsure if learning loss was going to continue. So to be proactive, we shared some ideas for creative scheduling at our June admin meeting. One strategy that several schools implemented prior to COVID with great success was a school-wide literacy block. Each day at a specific time, grade teams have a shared literacy block where students are split into targeted groups on particular literacy skills. For this 30-minute block, teachers, librarians, educational assistants, and admin, when possible, teach a small group of students targeting specific literacy skills for a 12 to 14-week cycle, and then assess and reevaluate.
Our teachers are now more open to looking at common year-end assessments. We're not sure if this is because of teachers' experience with our learning loss program and seeing firsthand that it's not about judging teachers, but about support.
Well, I'm sure that none of us wants to be in education again if another pandemic hits. We do believe that some great learnings came out of this. So our challenge to this group is to identify how teaching and learning may have improved as we came out of this pandemic. So in Red Deer Public Schools, I believe that the focus on intervening with our struggling learners has become more of a widespread practice across our division because
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry, and Dan. Some great things happening in Red Deer Public. And really a big thank you to all of our presenters today for sharing some important and exciting work that's happened in your school jurisdictions. Dan, I think you posed a very interesting question there about, sometimes we think the pandemic was all bad, and in many ways it was, but there was definitely some interesting things and new and innovative ways of doing our work that emerged. I mean, I'm not sure if 4 or 5 years ago, we would all be sitting in a call like this as a team of system education leaders from across the province engaging in collaborative discussions. So that was one that popped in my mind right away was, you know, even though during the pandemic, we all felt so disconnected, in many ways, we are more connected now than we've ever been. And I know for us up here in Fort McMurray, we're grateful for that increased network across the province, talking with people like all of you who do similar work. So great question, insightful, and we appreciate that. So that's going to bring us to the end here in just a moment. But before we say farewell, I know that Gloria, the Principal Leadership Consultant with CAS, would like to share a couple pieces of information with you. So over to you, Gloria.
Thank you so much, Matt and Danielle, and also to all of the presenters for just a fantastic morning, learning about your approaches to learning disruption from a system education leader perspective. And for those that are participating in the webinar, I do want to put in a little encouragement to have you look at some of our e-leadership guides. This is a new learning resource, an on-demand resource that's found on the CAS website in the Resource Center. One of the ones that we created last year was about learning disruption. And you'll find on this particular learning guide several stories of Alberta Stories of Practice about system education leadership and how different school authorities were dealing with learning disruption. This particular webinar will be posted and available for a very long time for access. We're creating a learning guide, and that will be advertised through CAS Connects when it's ready. So just wanted to let you know about that. Turn it over back to you, Matt and Danielle.
So thank you again to all of our presenters this morning, and a big thank you to Gloria for bringing us together to share our stories of practice. It was great to see how everybody kind of took it from a different perspective, but still interwove all of Danica's promising practices throughout all of the stories. So it was great getting to know all of you and hearing all of your stories. And we hope that you have a wonderful day and that there's not too much snow in your forecast over the next few days.